Hey, what's up, everyone? Dragon back again, here to tell you that you should be reading Ancient Magus Bride. So, Ancient Magus Bride is a Japanese manga written and illustrated by Kore Yamazaki, and basically follows two very curious characters. One, Chise Hitori, who is essentially almost a conduit for magic. This is a world in which, yes, magic exists and kind of falls into the category that I like to call kind of urban fantasy, where you have magic and sorcery, but it takes place in the modern day, in the modern world, as opposed to kind of a high fantasy world like Lord of the Rings or something like that, where it's in the kind of other world where everything is of a fantasy aesthetic. It's more or less how the magical world essentially kind of exists in secret underneath the real world. Basically, Harry Potter, for probably a more recognizable reference. And essentially, she is bought off by Elias Ainsworth, who, while can making himself look human, is anything but. And when you get a look at him, he basically looks like a very tall man, dressed in a very kind of almost 18th century proper attire, but has a head. Essentially, basically is like a skull of some kind of canine with horns. Essentially, he looks like basically a demon, for lack of a better description. And essentially buys her off at an auction and is essentially training her or teaching her to be a mage like him. And given that her natural proficiency for magic and just how she is, or rather, magical creatures that go unseen to the non-magical eye are essentially drawn to her, including other kinds of fairy folk and what have you. And on the surface, that's kind of what the story is about. It's basically him just, he bought her, which sounds really kind of bad when you kind of just say it that way, but it's essentially giving her a good life. He has a nice little home in the English countryside, where he treats her very well. He clothes her, houses her, feeds her, gives her a certain degree of personal freedom, and with the promise of teaching her and training her, as opposed to just kind of using her. But you come to find out that's exactly what he's doing, but not in the way you would expect, not in the way of somebody else buying her might use her for. He's not necessarily using her for her magic. He's using her, in an essence, to kind of be normal in a strange way, because he himself, while having been around for a few hundred years at this point, doesn't know how to really live a normal life. He doesn't really understand what it means to just kind of be acclimated into kind of normal life, normal society, and basically doesn't really understand human emotion, or rather the kind of connections that we ourselves make in a kind of general social setting. So in other words, he's extremely socially awkward, but he doesn't know why. He doesn't understand what makes him so awkward. He basically is using her to kind of learn how to basically connect with normal people, how to kind of have normal, basic social interactions, things that we take for granted because we kind of grow up with that. We grew up, encountering different kinds of people in a general social setting. So for us, we just kind of learn the basic ins and outs, just how to deal with people and how to deal with our emotions. And that's the other thing here. With her, he is experiencing a new range of emotions that he doesn't really understand or know really what to do with, despite his ability to kind of intellectualize them. His goal is essentially to marry her. He's even said, "You will be my bride." But it doesn't take long for you to kind of realize that he doesn't really understand what that means. He doesn't know what it really means to be married, so he just has kind of heard of this, learned of this, and kind of has decided that that's the normal thing to do. If you want to make a connection with somebody, like a deep connection with somebody, okay, you should just marry them. Not really understanding what that means, what that entails, or kind of the emotional weight behind such an implication. And through this process, which, by the way, this could easily sound like kind of a dark, almost kind of nefarious story, even a bit, dare I say, serial killer-esque. It doesn't play out that way. It's very sweet, but you kind of watch the tragedy that is his life, in the sense that he is essentially a shadow, both kind of metaphorically speaking, and in some ways literally, because he's kind of a being of shadow. It's kind of the core of kind of his, I guess, abilities or his magical ability. He's a creature of shadow. And again, he is coming to terms with feelings and emotions. Like it is essentially that he has strong feelings for her, and that his love for her is, in fact, genuine. But he doesn't understand what to do when he feels emotions, when he, for instance, experiences jealousy for the first time because she has a friend over, a girl from one of the neighboring villages comes to visit, and because Chise is spending time with this other individual, that in this moment she is making this other individual kind of the center of her attention, of her focus, he essentially runs off, not really understanding why. And when she gives chase and catches up with him, he essentially just kind of grabs and holds her, just keeps her there, not really understanding why he's doing it, but all the while kind of intellectually explaining it to her that he feels the need to have her, to keep her, and that he does not like the idea, or rather the idea of her giving kind of all her attention to somebody else, makes him feel bad. And he's, again, articulating himself very well, expressing these emotions, and all the while not understanding what it is he's talking about. Not understanding that what he's talking about is jealousy. And that is where she comes into play, where she has to explain that to him. So for someone who was kind of raised as different or treated almost freakish because of her magical inclinations, she is now essentially the one teaching him how to be a normal person. So he is teaching her how to, about the kind of what our society would deem as abnormal. And she is essentially teaching him just the ins and out of being kind of a cognitive reasoning individual with a wide range of emotions. Is that when you make connections with other people, they can allow you to play host a whole series of new emotions and feelings, some very good, some very bad, and most of them kind of falling in the middle somewhere. So it's this kind of strange yet very sweet story about essentially, a girl with incredible magical abilities and, lack of a better description, a demon who is completely just ignorant really of his own sense of self, doesn't really know where he came from, and doesn't always know that sometimes his negative behavior is negative because he's never had a counterbalance in which to measure them to. He doesn't really know that some of the things he might have done in the past were bad, as the story gets into, because he's never had anything to kind of really reflect it off. He is, and he's been taught what he's been taught by other magical users, by other mages, and now he is trying to live a normal life to some degree. So he does what he thinks is normal. He's gonna get a wife, get married, live in the countryside with her, even though to get his wife, he purchased her at an auction, and essentially, acquires her, or attempts to acquire her hand in marriage through a system of barter. I will teach you magic if you will be my wife, essentially, and that's the way it goes. And to him, it's perfectly normal. It's perfectly logical. I get something I want, you get something you want. It's great. And it is through this process with this girl that he basically kind of learns all the gray area that inhabits life. And she finds herself very taken with him because there is something very pure about him. His desire for this, his wanting this, is not malicious or based on any kind of greed. It is very much an honest desire to just make a connection beyond what he currently is. And it is because of this story that it is really kind of a reflection of how important interpersonal relationships are for us in real life, and how much we take for granted the connections that we sometimes have. And for a lot of people who perhaps have been denied certain basic relationship and connections throughout their life, how difficult it can be for them to make those kinds of connections, and how they may long for them but not know how to go about getting them, and furthermore not really knowing what to do with them once they acquire them, finding themselves very inexperienced, and the frustration that can come with that inexperience, knowing that you should know more about it than you actually do. So for that reason alone, it is kind of an interesting reflection on kind of just what it means to make connections with other people, and the varying kinds of connections you can make with other people. So again, it's not a very complicated story, but there's a lot of kind of emotional depth to it, in the sense that it really makes you question a lot of the things that perhaps you take for granted in life, the very basics, the way you're able to kind of move about life and the way you interact with people as you do so, and how easily certain things come to us. Even people who are at best, are even a little socially awkward, there's usually some degree of basics that they get down that this character is having a lot of trouble with, and Chise is really helping him along. So this is really less of a story about her learning how to use magic and more of a story about teaching someone who's only thrown up the guise of a man to get through life at times, and what it actually means to be one. What it would mean to be in love with somebody, what it would mean to actually to basically kind of form that connection. It's in a weird, on the surface might look like a bit of a Beauty and the Beast story, but whereas Beast was always more of like an angry, aggressive, character who had to learn to kind of soften and through love kind of learn to find a heart. This is a character who's not mean, who's not he has aggressive tendencies when he needs to defend her, but is not this raging, bull of a character, but rather just a character who is completely oblivious to what it means to have and to feel all the things he wants to have and to feel. And through the course of this story, he's going to learn what that means. So it's a sweet story, and it's kind of an interesting take on, like I said, the Beauty and the Beast kind of motif. It makes it a bit more original, and I think it's a more modern telling of the story, not just because it's a modern taking place now and written now, but because it just feels like it will speak to people more as they are today, as opposed to the kind of classic black and white. I was mean, so I'm a beast, and I have to love will soften my heart. This is not that kind of story. It's a bit more simple in a way, but at the same time, I think the nature in which it's presented, you can connect with it a lot more easily. So I think, and again, I just find it a bit more interesting, the approach the storyteller takes with it. But yeah, so it's a fun story. The artwork is very beautiful. There is an anime currently airing at the time of this recording, which I highly recommend you check out as well. Give it a look, give it a check. If you're not really into manga or just comics by and large, this is a good one to get into it, because it's not like it has this whole mythology behind it where there's so much to get into and where do I start. It's kind of a simple story. You just kind of get into it. And again, a lot of what it focuses on is not so much the fantastical elements of the story, but rather the more down-to-earth stuff, really. And I think for someone who is perhaps not as familiar with fantasy or anything like that, this might be kind of a good way to kind of get your feet wet with it and kind of venture in, so to speak, and get a feel for it while still having connection to something that feels very real world, and then from there you can kind of venture out and get into more the high fantasy, sword and sorcery kind of fantasy, whereas this, like I said, is more urban fantasy. It takes place ultimately in our world, in our time, with fantastical elements sprinkled throughout. But anyway, Ancient Magus Bride. Have you read it? If so, what did you think? If not, I'll put some links in the description section below where you can pick it up, check it out. Do check out the anime too. I really enjoy the anime as well. I think it's a lot of fun. So either or, even if you haven't read the manga, you've only watched the anime, still come in, give me some of your thoughts. I'd still be very curious to hear what your take on the story is. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace!